The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the empty office. It was late, much later than usual. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall, 10:45 p.m. She was the last one left, the only soul in the sprawling, dimly lit building. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, the rhythmic clacking breaking the silence that had settled in like a thick fog. She had promised herself she would finish the project by morning, but now, as the hours dragged on, she felt the weight of fatigue pressing down on her. The office was usually a bustling place filled with laughter and chatter. But tonight it was eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper from her desk. She shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. As she worked, her mind began to wander. She thought about the stories she had heard from other employees about the building, tales of strange noises, flickering lights, and shadows that moved on their own. She had always brushed them off as office gossip, but now, alone in the dark, they crept back into her thoughts. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. Sarah jumped, her heart racing. She glanced around the empty office, the shadows stretching across the floor. Just the wind, she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the unease. She returned to her work, but her concentration was shattered. The noise had come from the storage room at the end of the hall, a place she had always avoided. It was filled with old files and forgotten furniture, a relic of the company's past. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stood up. She needed to investigate. Maybe it was just a loose window or a stray object falling. She walked slowly down the corridor, each step echoing in the stillness. The air felt heavy, as if something was watching her. As she reached the storage room door, she hesitated. The handle was cold to the touch, sending a shiver up her spine. With a quick push, the door creaked open, revealing the dark interior. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through a small window. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer came, just the silence that enveloped her like a shroud. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was stale, and the shadows seemed to shift around her. She scanned the room, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Just old furniture and forgotten memories. As she turned to leave, she heard it again, a soft whisper, barely audible. It sent chills down her spine. "Hello," she called again, more forcefully this time. The whisper faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Feeling a surge of adrenaline, Sarah rushed back to her desk, her mind racing. She tried to focus on her work, but the unease lingered. Every creak of the building made her jump. Every flicker of the lights sent her heart racing. Minutes turned into hours, and soon it was past midnight. The office was still and oppressive, the silence almost deafening. Just as she was about to call it a night, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. This time fear gripped her. She grabbed her phone, its light a small comfort in the darkness. With trembling hands, she stepped into the hallway, the beam of light cutting through the shadows. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice stronger than she felt. The hallway was empty, but the air felt charged, as if something was lurking just out of sight. She took a few cautious steps forward, her heart racing. The crash had come from the break room. She approached the door, her breath quickening. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. The break room was a mess. Chairs were overturned and the table was scattered with papers. But there was no one there, just the remnants of chaos. "Okay, this isn't funny," she said, trying to convince herself that it was just a prank. But deep down, she felt a creeping dread. She turned to leave when she noticed something on the floor, a small, crumpled piece of paper. Curiosity piqued. She picked it up. It was a note hastily written in a shaky hand. Get out while you can. A chill ran down her spine. Who had written this? Why? Panic surged through her, and she bolted back to her desk, her mind racing. She needed to leave. As she gathered her things, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. When they returned, she felt a presence behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office, the shadows stretching across the walls. Get a grip, Sarah, she whispered to herself, but her hands trembled as she packed her bag. Just as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from her coworker. Mark, hey, are you still at the office? I just saw something weird outside. Her heart raced. What do you mean? She typed back, her fingers shaking. Just trust me. Get out of there. Now. Fear gripped her as she read the message. She grabbed her bag and headed for the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway felt longer than before, the shadows closing in around her. As she reached the front door, she fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with sweat. The lights flickered again, and she heard a low growl, deep and menacing. Please, please, she whispered, finally managing to unlock the door. She pushed it open and stumbled into the cool night air, gasping in relief. But as she turned to leave, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty parking lot, the moon casting an airy glow over the cars. Breathing heavily, she hurried to her car, glancing over her shoulder. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and swirling in the darkness. She fumbled with her keys, her heart racing as she finally got the door open and slid inside. As she started the engine, she glanced back at the building. The windows were dark, but she could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the shadows watching her. With a jolt, she pulled out of the parking lot, her heart pounding. She drove home, the road stretching out before her like a dark tunnel. But even as she left the office behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. The shadows danced on the edges of her vision, and she felt a chill creep up her spine. Once home, she locked the door and drew the curtains tight. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the unease lingered. That night, she tossed and turned in bed, haunted by the events of the evening. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every shadow seemed to loom larger than life. In the early hours of the morning, she finally drifted off to sleep, but her dreams were filled with dark figures and whispers that echoed through the night. When she woke up, the sun was shining, but the fear still clung to her. She decided to take a day off work, needing time to recover from the night's events. But as the days passed, she found it harder to shake the feeling of dread. She avoided the office, but the whispers seemed to follow her. One evening, a week later, she received another text from Mark. I'm worried about you. Can we talk? She agreed to meet him at a cafe. As they sat down, he looked pale and anxious. Have you been back to the office? He asked, his voice low. No, I can't. I feel like something's in there, she admitted, her heart racing. Mark nodded, looking troubled. I've been hearing things too. Strange noises, shadows moving. I think we should do something. What do you mean? She asked, fear creeping back in. I think we need to go back. Together. We need to find out what's going on, he said, determination in his eyes. After a moment of hesitation, Sarah nodded. Okay, let's do it. That night they returned to the office armed with flashlights and a sense of dread. The building loomed before them, dark and silent, as they stepped inside. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. They walked down the familiar hallway, the shadows stretching around them. As they reached the storage room, Sarah's heart raced. She felt a pull and urge to go inside. "Let's check it out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, and they stepped into the darkness together. The air was thick with dust, and the shadows seemed to pulse around them. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the room. They jumped, their flashlights flickering. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, fear gripping her. "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice tense. They moved cautiously toward the sound, the darkness closing in around them. As they turned a corner, they found a box lying on the floor, its contents scattered. But then they saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching them. It was tall and dark, its features obscured. "Who are you?" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, and they could see its face pale and twisted, eyes hollow and dark. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, its voice a chilling rasp. Panic surged through Sarah as she turned to run, but the figure lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a cold grip. Mark shouted, pulling her away, but the figure was strong, its presence suffocating. They stumbled back, trying to escape, but the shadows seemed to close in around them, trapping them in darkness. "Run!" Mark yelled, and they bolted back down the hallway, the figure pursuing them with an unnatural speed. As they reached the front door, Sarah fumbled with the handle, her heart racing. The lights flickered, and she felt a cold breath on her neck. With a final push, they burst through the door and into the night, gasping for breath. They didn't stop running until they reached Mark's car, collapsing inside. "What was that?" Sarah panted, her heart racing. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Mark replied, his face pale. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back at the office building, its dark silhouette looming in the distance. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, but deep down she knew this wasn't over. The whispers had followed her home, and the shadows still lurked in the corners of her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the familiar sound of whispers echoing through the darkness. "Get out while you can," they seemed to say, chilling her to the bone. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah tried to move on, but the fear never left her. She avoided the office, but the nightmares returned, filled with dark figures and shadows that seemed to reach out for her. One evening, she received a call from HR. "We need you to come in. There's been an incident," the voice on the other end said. Her stomach dropped. "What kind of incident?" she asked, dread pooling in her chest. "There's been a report of strange occurrences, and we need your input," the voice replied. Against her better judgment, she agreed to return. As she stepped into the office, the familiar feeling of dread washed over her. The air was thick with tension, and the lights flickered overhead. She made her way to the conference room, where a small group of employees had gathered. "We've been experiencing strange noises and shadows," one of her co-workers said, his face pale. "We think it might be connected to the storage room." Sarah's heart raced. "I saw something in there," she admitted, her voice trembling. As they discussed the incidents, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through the group, and they scrambled for their phones, the glow of the screens illuminating their faces. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, and the door burst open. The figure stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on them. "Get out!" it screamed, its voice a chilling echo. The group erupted into chaos, rushing for the exits. Sarah felt a cold grip on her arm, and she turned to see Mark, his face pale with fear. "Let's go," he shouted, and they bolted down the hallway, the figure pursuing them. They stumbled into the stairwell, racing down the steps as the shadows closed in around them. As they reached the ground floor, Sarah felt a surge of panic. "We need to get out of here," she yelled, pushing through the door. They burst into the parking lot, gasping for breath. But as they turned to leave, they felt the air shift, a cold presence surrounding them. The figure stood at the entrance, blocking their escape. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice echoing in the night. Panic surged through Sarah as she grabbed Mark's hand, pulling him away. "We have to find another way." They ran toward the back of the building, searching for an escape, but the shadows seemed to close in around them, trapping them in darkness. As they reached the rear exit, they found it locked. "No," Sarah cried, pounding on the door. Mark turned to her, his face grim. "We have to go back inside," he said, desperation in his voice. "Are you crazy?" Sarah shouted. "We can't stay out here," he insisted. With no other choice, they turned back, racing toward the entrance. But as they stepped inside, the figure was waiting for them, its eyes glowing in the darkness. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed, its voice a chilling echo. Panic surged through Sarah as they stumbled back, but the shadows closed in around them, suffocating. In that moment, she realized the truth. The office was alive, feeding on their fear, trapping them in its grasp. With a surge of determination, she grabbed Mark's hand. "We have to fight," she shouted. Together they faced the figure, their fear transforming into anger. "You don't control you," Sarah yelled, her voice strong. The figure hesitated, its form flickering in the darkness. They pushed forward, the light from their phones cutting through the shadows. As they moved closer, the figure let out a chilling scream, its form dissolving into the darkness. The shadows receded, and the air felt lighter. With a final push, they burst through the entrance and into the night, gasping for breath. As they stood in the parking lot, the office loomed behind them, dark and silent, but they felt a sense of relief wash over them. They had faced the darkness and survived, but as they drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for their return. The whispers had followed her home, and the darkness still lingered in the corners of her mind. And deep down she knew the office would never truly let them go.